My mother basically programmed me to do this. I mean, she was a multi-major scholar at Marietta College, among whose majors was history. And so I learned to read with paleontology, geology, and archaeology books, and knew by the time I was in the 6th grade that I was going to go to the University of Arizona. So I never wanted to do anything else, nor, for that matter, would I have ever wanted to or been allowed to. We think people arrive at this location initially about 16,000 radiocarbon years ago, or 14,000 radiocarbon years BCE, thereabouts. Calibrated, you end up with various calibrations for that. So I'd rather continue using just the radiocarbon years. We have a few bits and pieces of things that have produced earlier midpoint dates, but the plus or minus on those is so high that when you subtract it, it ends up around 16 anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why we've taken the conservative approach instead of the deeper approach. Of course, it's an open site that was excavated like an open site. It wasn't in a building. He couldn't control a lot of the excavation parameters we could control. He certainly expended a tremendous amount of effort in the precision of the excavations. So I think from the idea of being as resolute and getting as much probative data as you can, we had very similar strategic approaches. Tactically, because of the circumstances at both sites, it was obviously different. And then the material remains, of course, are different. I think it's not the miller's relationship necessarily to Eurasiatic stuff. It's that small blade assemblage and those polyhedral blade cores that look like things that you see in northern China and Manchuria. The unfluted, flat-based or slightly concave projectile point model, so to speak, you can track all the way across Asia. It's just the addition of the flutes over here that makes it so uniquely Clovis. I don't think, unless, as Jennings used to say, the Bering Strait's doorway swings both ways. I don't think unless you carried fluting technology back across that they ever did it over there. So in terms of the overall shape, you have certain similarities, but the degree of congruence, say, between the Miller from here, the stuff that Dunbar calls Miller-like in Florida, the stuff that Mike Collins says is Miller-like in Texas, is much greater in terms of congruence than the Miller is to any particular Eurasian point. Back in Sellard's original work 100 years ago, the critique that was raised about it essentially devolved around the resolution of his data. And Hrdlicka and others said, you missed X or you missed Y or you missed Z, or you couldn't demonstrate context or you couldn't demonstrate association. What we wanted to do from the outset, no matter what we found, was to do it as precisely as humanly possible given the current state of the art. And since we had plenty of experience doing that, not just at Meadowcroft, but dozens of other sites where we've worked in the past, we decided to do the Vero thing as resolutely as possible for now, for 2017 or 2014 when we started, no matter what it turned out telling us about the place. In other words, we weren't trying to demonstrate that Sellards was right or he was wrong. We wanted to demonstrate to anyone's satisfaction who wanted to look at the data that the data says this or it says that. What it said, we could care less. We have a couple of pieces of fabric that are burnt, otherwise they would have never been preserved, that have come out of the disturbed overburden that we think might have been, when they dug the canal, cut out of one of the archaic levels at the site and dumped on top of the surface that cellars used to work on. In other words, such things as we found in the overburden of whatever age they turn out to be. We also have, for instance, this is kind of funny, but the oldest dated cow bone from Florida, domestic cow, it may have actually been one of DeSoto's cows. But I mean, the fact that the overburden has stuff of all ages in it, and some of it is Pleistocene fauna that came out of the dredging of the canal, some of it came from scraping the walls. So these additional textiles that we have found are probably Middle Archaic, and they look remarkably like the stuff from Wendover.
Right.
And I wouldn't be surprised ultimately if they turned out to be that kind of thing, accompaniments to human interments. What we're doing now is looking for other localities in the general area that Sellards identified 100 years ago that he thought were potential locations for either Pleistocene fauna and or late Ice Age artifactual material, or both. So we're in the midst now of trying to figure out where to dig next. I have never personally seen it or a cast of it.
Oh, really?
I do know the guy who allegedly found it,
Right.
who is remarkably vague about precisely where it comes from. And my colleague Andy Hemmings, who's cited in that article,
Yes.
has seen and handled the original, and he's absolutely convinced it's a fake.
Oh, really?
But other people that you guys know, like Barbara Purdy, is convinced it's real. So I have no personal opinion about it. It looks like the kind of thing that somebody at that time might have done. Did they do that piece? I don't know. The guy who found it is an interesting character. I think that because we have been in a male-dominated field since the 1830s, because literally all of the geologists at that time, all of the would-be avocational archaeologists were men, we've had a very powerful bias to interpreting the archaeological record in male terms. And I think, well, for instance, when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Arizona in '62, there were almost as many undergraduate anthropology majors as there are now. There were like 500 of them.
Right.
One woman.
Oh.
One. Who actually happened to be black. So it's even more remarkable. But in any case, now if you go to any institution, any one that anthropology is taught in, or even geology nowadays, the representation of females is always greater than 50%. And that's bound to have a difference. It's bound to make a difference. I think if you look objectively at the archaeological record, you look at the ethnographic record, and you have to conclude that most of what hunter-gatherers make is non-durable.
Right.
It's well, look at ourselves now. The eyelets of your boots, a watch if you have one in your pocket, your pen, your buttons. I mean, you have almost no durable stuff at all.
Right.
And it's all of us are wearing perishable items. And had we been alive then, everything we're wearing would be natural plant fiber, natural this, natural that. And the likelihood would have been that all of our stuff, just like the factories that made our shirts now are mainly staffed with females, that our shirts or whatever passed for them at the time would have been made by women. And when you recall all that, and you're looking at an archaeological site, and you recall things like we did all the fabrics from Windover, we analyzed them. In that whole 170 odd burials, all the stone tools from that site that they thought were important enough to take to the next life with you fit in your hand.
Yeah.
But all the, a huge number of them had fancy fabrics and all that stuff. All the burials of women had awls and needles and all kinds of stuff like that. So I think you can get support for the importance of those technologies, both directly from the archaeological data and indirectly. Did I ever think about it much before the Dark Lord made me think about it? Probably not.
Right.
But he didn't leave you a lot of room. Well, I think you can get fair representations ethnographically of females working stone for certain purposes. I don't know, I'm not that familiar with the data to know if any of those ethnographically attested to incidences of females making stone tools involves fine work or not. I just don't know.
Right.
But I would not be at all surprised that there are circumstances and occasions where they could and probably did do that because of the fineness of some of the non-stone stuff that they do. Some of those awls, some of that string, some of those cords they're phenomenally complicated.
Right.
It requires an incredible level of hand-eye coordination and whatever that, not saying guys couldn't have made them and probably did occasionally, but I don't have any problem imagining females doing it. You probably have dealt with archaeologists who want nothing to do with avocational archaeologists. Not that they simply have that kind of that flavor of academic arrogance that only some obnoxious PhD can have, and they're not redeemable. By the same token, you find others who have, from the beginning of their careers, dealt with non-professionals productively, whether it's somebody like Dale Crow's working in the Pacific Northwest with Native Americans, whose insights into some of the wet sites he's digging have been very informative, or you have people who take insights from amateurs on a very regular basis because they find that the non-professionals simply have more field experience in their own backyard than you do as a stranger. And I think to automatically rule out any source of information is insane. I mean, by the same token, to convince an amateur who has been badly treated that he ought to interface with you is a whole nother thing altogether. I think one needs to find one of the sympathetic archaeology or geoarchaeology types that likes and has worked with avocational sorts, or that can be introduced to such a person because of their participation previously in a professional project. I mean, Al has hundreds of volunteers that have worked at Topper. They in turn know hundreds more folk who are avocationalists and can act as an introduction to Al and or his people. And the same is true all over the country. There are sympathetic folks just as there are hyper unsympathetic folks. And like I said, I think to rule out, we were, just as an example, we were doing archaeological survey on the island of Cyprus, in western Cyprus, in the late 60s and early 70s. And we got some of the best insights into the locations of sites from local Turkish-speaking and Greek-speaking shepherds who knew where the sites were. But many of our professional colleagues wouldn't even talk to these guys because they were shepherds. Jennings used to tell us when we were working, I worked in that part of Nevada that borders on Arizona, where there are a whole host of very remote canyons and so forth, many of which to this day are peopled by minority Mormon polygamous communities. And they know the local countryside like the back of their hand. They've lived there for 150 years and they're not uninformed about Native American sites or anything else. To not tap that really unusual resource to understand where sites might be of some time period would be insane. Similarly, in a lot of those small Nevada towns, the general store doubles as a saloon and a one-night stand house of prostitution. To not talk to those folk who know the landscape or at least can introduce you to a miner or somebody that knows the landscape is crazy. And yet you'll have archaeologists that won't do any of that stuff. I know that Tom Dillahay found out about Monteverde from a woodcutter. I know that I found out about this from a historian who knew Albert Miller. I think most of the really spectacular, recently excavated sites were discovered by non-professionals. I think if you look around the world, that's got to be the case. I think we North American archaeologists, whether it's US or Canadian, have tended to underestimate the complexity that's possible to encounter in hunting-gathering societies. And so to find a place that seems to amply attest to not only complicated architecture, but presumably some kind of socio-religious or sociological practices that represent much greater complexity than we're willing to talk about is typical. I mean, in other words, we seem, despite being immersed in ethnographic data that should tell us otherwise, we seem to be still willing to ignore vast chunks of what we understand to be the case or should understand to be the case. I think and I don't think that's unique to this field. I think my first job, so to speak, at Arizona, I was a TA in a geology class. And the guy who taught the class did not believe that continents moved. I mean, he was not a Wegener disciple of any sort. And he was like, okay. And this is, 70 years later, 60 years later. So I'm sure that's the case for auto mechanics or anybody else that finds themselves in a circumstance where the received wisdom, whatever it is, about anything is different than what they were raised with. I think if you have, first of all, if we had a truly representative array of radiocarbon dates on the extinctions of specific genera and species, we'd find that after 20,000 or so years ago, from the height of the last glacial maximum to the end of the Pleistocene, you've got extinctions going on specifically in certain areas that humans in some cases had absolutely nothing to do with, that involved insects or birds or God knows what. And in other cases may have provided the final trip out the door for the last of their kind, dodo-like, Mauritius type stuff. But I think we have somehow chosen to we seem to be compelled to try to explain things we don't necessarily have enough information to explain. And so there's a tendency to seize on things, whether it's the platinum anomaly or some other kind of thing, as a possible explanation to a much more complicated problem that it can't be the only explanation to.
Right.
It's, again, using analogies to something far removed. I mean, like car racing or motorcycle racing or something like that. And you find these mechanics who will say, well, it's got to be this. And it's not that. It's probably 15 things.
Right.
But they'll seize on one thing and make it the solution to a very complicated problem. I'm not saying in this case that they're wrong, but there's probably a lot more going on than that. When we started here, it was, as you've heard or written or read, it was initially a field school experience to teach students, albeit under trying circumstances, the protocols of contemporary archaeology and geology and botany and a bunch of other stuff. But we never approached it as a goal, so to speak, beyond the methodological implications of it. I don't think I've ever had a goal in the sense that you're talking about, so that I think making people aware of not what we've learned, but how we've learned it is probably more important to me than any substantive result, whether it's a cool piece of string from Vero or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's how we found and documented that piece of string that's more important to me than the piece of string, frankly. I think the reaction that people have when they visited the Vero excavation or Meadowcroft, when professionals say, I didn't even know you could do this stuff, that's both sad on the one hand and challenging on the other, because you want more people to understand how to do this stuff, at least in our version of what the right way is.
Right.
I think that's the whole thing. And this kind of thing provides one mechanism for doing that. In other words, I assume this reaches or potentially will reach people who will think about, more than they would otherwise think about, how you do it. Mm. And as we've said about Meadowcroft, it's not the antiquity of the site, it's the thousands of years of interdigitation of people with a very subtly shifting environment, and the ability to document those interdigitations through time, that it's more important to us than however old it is. That it was old was icing on a cake we never wanted to bake. But we did want to tell people how to bake that kind of